What if I told you that there are only 3 ways of making a sound, and that in all 3 of those ways, the same 2 principles apply? Let's talk about designing sounds. This video is part of a series I'm doing called the Triangle Method, which breaks down the sound sculpting process into 3 layers. There's the level of the sequencing, the level of the sound design, and the level of the effects. And today, we're talking about the sound source. So the thing that makes the sound. Last week we gave 9 approaches to sequencing sounds, and so now we're going to talk about the 3 ways to make a sound and the 2 principles that you want to keep in mind no matter what your method is of making sound. Let's get into that. The 3 ways of making sounds are synthesizers, and in this bucket I'm including literally every synthesis method. The second way is samplers, and under samplers I'm including multi-samplers as well. And then the third way is acoustic objects, which is literally like most of music history. But anyway, these 3 categories: synthesis, sampling, and acoustic objects. Choose your poison or mix and match them as you see fit. And so no matter which tools you use, which of those 3, there are 2 principles that will always apply. The first principle is that you want to shape the timbre. That means how simple is the sound, how rich is the sound, how smooth is it, how harsh is it, how harmonic is it, and how inharmonic is it. These are all questions of the timbre. And then the second question is, how are you going to take control of the dynamics of the sound? And the dynamics of the sound essentially means, how does the sound change over time? How and when will this sound be bright or dark? How and when is it short and when is it long? When is it loud and quiet? Can you control those parameters when you take control of the sound? That's the skill that you need to develop as a musician and as a music producer. So shaping the timbre and shaping the dynamics. You can almost think of the difference between timbre and dynamics as like, the timbre is what is the identity of the sound? What are the things about that sound that are kind of stable over time? And then the dynamics is, how does that sound express itself? How does this sound change over time? Some of this comes back down to just simply how a synthesizer works. So let's look at that. Let's look at synthesis as a way of creating sound, and let's talk about timbre and dynamics within that. If we want to talk about a sound's timbre, we have to clarify a few concepts in our mind first. First of all, let's remember that every sound is made up out of frequencies. So every sound is made up of a combination of frequencies. It can be very clean and pure and hollow, like a sine wave. You see how this sine wave only has one frequency. When it starts, it just goes ooh, one frequency. It has no harmonics. Harmonics are extra frequencies that make a sound more interesting. And the sine wave is a freak of nature in that there is only one frequency inside of it. We could, for example, take a triangle wave and get something like this. See the difference here already. See how there's still that one frequency. We call that the fundamental frequency. But now above that frequency, there's also a whole bunch of other frequencies. And it just so happens that they happen to be in nice, even mathematical multiples. That gets even more pronounced if we use a sawtooth wave like this. See that? Our sound timbre is becoming brighter, harsher, buzzier, more in your face, and basically just taking up a lot of space. Watch how they dance around. As I play different notes, all the relevant frequencies all go up together and come down together. This is a very clean and pretty sound because also each of the harmonics has such a strong mathematical relationship with the fundamental. It's like each harmonic is a double or a triple or a quadruple of the fundamental. However, it doesn't have to be this way. You can create timbres where the distribution of harmonics is very unequal and uneven and doesn't even necessarily have a lot of relationship with the fundamental. One place where we see this, for example, is in our own voice. Our own voice is doing something very similar to this, except there are certain frequencies that pop out called formants, and those formants create the vowel sounds that our throat produces. So literally any sound that you make has a combination of frequencies, but their relationship is probably going to be a bit more inharmonic and a bit more complex than one of these perfect sawtooth waves. knowing this as a principle also means that you can very quickly think, okay, well, this sound is too clean, too perfect, too pristine. Maybe what I can do is mess with the frequencies a bit to make sure that it gets a bit grittier. And there's two ways within a synthesizer that immediately come to mind. One would be maybe you filter away a bunch of frequencies, and then you distort things to add harmonics that are not necessarily even and clean multiples of the fundamental, through, for example, some FM synthesis, through maybe some ring modulation. See what ring modulation does to the distribution of these frequencies? So that's without the ring modulation, with ring modulation. And as you move this around, the distribution of your frequencies gets gnarly. Wavetable synths are also a great way of finding sounds that already at the level of the oscillator, at the very start of the sound signal, they already have a lot of character. So for example, you can go to something like this, and as you move through the wavetable, you get all sorts of colors. Let me go down an octave. Now, notice also the density of the harmonics in the high frequencies. We are very sensitive to frequencies around, let's say, 3000 to 5000 hertz. And so if those frequencies are very prominent, we're going to say that the sound has a bit of a nasal quality, a bit of a like forward, it kind of hits your head kind of a quality. Whereas if you remove those or de-emphasize those, for example, by filtering them, you can get a much more warm and round timbre. Here, let's go down another octave. Nice. It's quite beautiful to watch now. So the conclusion is that within a synthesizer, you're not just stuck with the tones you're given. You can shape the timbre from clean to harsh, from harmonic to inharmonic. And by the way, if this is maybe the most harmonic sound that you can imagine, because all the harmonics are perfect, then this is the most inharmonic sound you can imagine, where none of the frequencies have any relationship to any of the other frequencies. Pure white noise. Pure harmonic. Pure inharmonic. And of course, you don't have to just do one or the other. You can combine them and layer them and do whatever you like. Before we move on, there's also two more words that I would like to mention that are definitely relevant here, and that is transient and sustain. Imagine when you're slapping a drum. Right? There's two things that happen. One thing is that there is just an explosive force of your hand connecting to the object, which immediately radiates out inharmonic sounds in a very short burst. We call that the transient. And then you also start moving this membrane, right? The big part of the drum. And that starts moving, and that's much slower. And that's going to move backwards and forwards a certain number of times per second, creating a harmonic pitched sound, which we call the sustain. So there's the transient and the sustain, and the transient tends to be quite inharmonic and the sustain tends to be quite harmonic. Doesn't have to be that way, but in natural acoustics it tends to be that way. And so you can think about this when designing your timbre as well. Imagine, for example, putting a bit of an envelope at the start of your pitch so that it descends like that over time. And you make that real snappy, and maybe you go down an octave or two. So now you've got a transient and a sustain. The transient goes pew, and the sustain goes But notice that the pitch only really settles once you stay stable, and the transient is more of an explosive, unpitched kind of an energy. All right, let's talk about the second principle, which is about the dynamics. How does this sound express itself specifically within the context of your musical composition? What does this sound like at its loudest or at its quietest, at its brightest, at its darkest, at its shortest, and at its longest? Think of those dimensions. Think about the frequency domain. So when is it going to have the most frequencies versus when is it going to be the darkest, when it's going to have the least frequencies? And then the time domain, when is it going to be the longest and when is it going to be the shortest? And potentially also think about volume changes. That's the third dimension. When is it going to be loud and quiet? All these things are linked because let's take a little intermezzo and talk about the dynamics of acoustic objects. Picture, if you will, this acoustic object. From an emotional point of view, you know that there are two ways of playing it. There's soft, and there is hard. So the way I relate to the object emotionally is in one sliding scale. But if you think about it in terms of the physics of it, there are at least 3 dimensions to take into account. One is the amplitude. How loud is this thing? Like physically, how loud are the frequencies? That's interesting, but what's even more interesting to me is how many harmonics are there, how many upper frequencies are there versus how many lower frequencies. So if I play even softer, you see how there are not so many high frequencies? But, by the way, you can see my voice coming up there. That's kind of cute. But if I shake it hard, see how many high frequencies there are? That's sharp spike compared to. So in the frequency domain, emotionally louder sounds sound brighter. Similarly, another object, I hit it soft. So those peaks don't just mean amplitude loudness, they mean that it has more harmonics, more frequencies in the high frequencies. So we've got amplitude and we've got frequency, and now the third dimension is decay. So time, how do the frequencies resonate or stop resonating over time? And for that, one of these is really great. Quiet hit on this might sound a little bit like this. Now a loud hit might sound like this. Quiet. Loud. So notice that as you hit an object very loudly, it starts to resonate, and it stays resonating even after the hit has happened, and it slowly tails down to 0. So subjectively or emotionally louder sounds, they tend to resonate on a little bit longer. And here we see that dichotomy of the transient energy versus the sustain. That transient is still there. There's still an explosion when this hits the skin, but then the skin starts to resonate and it creates that long tail. So transient, sustain. Interesting, right? So if you are applying these ideas into a synthesizer, it can be as simple as using a filter that opens up. Maybe notes with a higher velocity open up a little bit further. And you can also use envelopes to make a sound ring out longer over time or to make it shorter and snappier. Literally every single synthesizer in the history of synthesizers, I think, has some way of giving the sound dynamics, of making it bigger and smaller, shorter, longer, brighter, darker. So master those controls, because then even if you flick through different timbres by going from preset to preset, you can be like, oh, I like this timbre. Let me shape the dynamics so that it sits well inside my track. And so to bring it back to our ways of generating sound, we have synthesizers, we have samplers, and we have acoustic objects. Samplers are really wonderful because you have access to such rich and diverse and impactful source sounds just by choosing what you sample. It can be drum sounds, can be vocals, can be stabs, can be orchestral hits, can be Foley and field recording and very nuanced things that you've recorded in the real world. Heck, you can even take an entire pre-composed song, throw it into a sampler, and take just a moment from it. Imagine we take some sound from a scene from Akira. Let's put like a really basic sequencing on there. Like let's re-trigger it every half a bar. And now it's up to us to shape the sound. And so we bring it back to our concepts, shaping the timbre and shaping the dynamics. What do we think about the timbre? It's pretty abstract, and I already like how atonal it is. So I don't think I want to shape too much differently about the timbre. Maybe let's pitch it down an octave. See what that does. That's a freaky ass sound. Let's stay up here, but let's use our inspiration from earlier and put a ring modulator on there. Cool. Now, let's say that this is our timbre for today, right? Now let's think about the dynamics. How long do we want this sound to be? Maybe I want, in terms of time, for it to be much shorter. There. Now it's leaving more space for other musical elements. Maybe I want some attack on it. Now let's think about that other dimension, the dark versus bright. Do we want all of these frequencies up here? Maybe not. Maybe let's put on some kind of a filter. Let's take away these frequencies and then let's give them back with an envelope so that we get a little bit of a transient or at least some kind of an articulation to the start of the sound. So here we give all the frequencies back at the start. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I would imagine something a bit more like this. That's cool, but less. Freaky sound, right? And now remember the triangle method. We've got a sequence going into a sound, and so we put on some kind of an effect. Going deeper on that will be for next week. So let's keep it real simple. Stick on a delay. Heck, here we go. That's a sound that would be interesting in a techno track. Just put like a cool groove underneath this, and this would absolutely work. I want to draw extra attention, by the way, to Ableton's drum sampler. This is a really simple sampler device. Well, simple, but it's very deep because you have all these weird effects for making a sound dirtier or grittier in some interesting way. So let's go back to our mental model about the timbre. Let's take a timbre that's kind of clean, like for example a 909 rim shot, and let's dirty it up by changing the harmonics of it. Okay, see this? Let's dirty this up by putting on an effect. Like we were working with ring modulation, let's do that again. Adding this gritty overtones up here. Basically making something that was clean and harmonic, a bit more dirty and inharmonic. FM is very good at doing this as well. Frequency modulation. That'll really mess with the harmonics of your song. And so, for example, you can set the velocity to affect the filter. So you can have some hits have a low velocity. See, you can play with that dynamic. So some dark hits and some bright hits. Picture me playing on that drum from earlier. You have some dark hits and some light hits. Let's make the difference a bit more subtle. It feels much more human, and we have a much more emotional connection to the sound if it has some dynamics in this way. Now, we already spoke about acoustic objects earlier, but remember that these principles apply to everything. So, for example, some drummers might shape the timbre of their instruments by putting some things inside. Like, for example, you could muffle it and make it darker by putting in some clothes or some kind of textile that gently muffles the sound. Or you could go the opposite direction and change the timbre by brightening it. There are a lot of drums in the world where they put like guitar strings essentially on the back so that every time that you hit it, it rattles out and creates some really high sharp harmonics. So just as in the world of synthesizers, in the acoustic world, people are also shaping the timbre of their instruments so that then when they play it, they can shape the dynamics as well. And the interplay between those two concepts really makes a sound tasty and beautiful and organic. If you put this inside the idea of the triangle method, it represents really 1/3 of finding some beautiful musical pattern. You make something at the level of the sequencing, at the level of the sound source, and at the level of the effects, and you ping pong between those ideas backwards and forwards until you hit a sweet spot. I hope this perspective gives you some tools for your own sound design project. If you like the way I teach, maybe go follow one of my courses, and until next time, stay producing, be good to each other, and take care. Bye-bye.